So Chris Hedges and Russell Brand had a pretty interesting conversation about the war economy. And I think it's important for us to remember when we're talking about these wars, Russia, Ukraine, etc., it's important to understand that the military industrial complex profits off of it. And that's really what it is all about. It is all about profit. If there was no profit in war, we would have a hell of a lot of peace. Don't write that down. No, I'm just saying it's true. Like, we'd have a hell of a lot of peace if you think about it. So let's get into this discussion with Russell Brand and Chris Hedges. I'm going to chime in here and there because I thought there were some really powerful things that were said in this discussion. And if you haven't had a chance to do so, don't forget to smash that like button. Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about the perpetual state of war.
We have 800 bases around the globe. There has to be a massive retraction.
The repackaging of these conflicts that has changed, the marketing of these wars.
After World War II, you had a perpetuation of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
We'll be talking about the escalation of conflict between Western nations and China, the impossibility of alliances outside of centralized establishment politics, and when the liberal left went wrong. Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble. Thanks for joining us, Chris. It's lovely to talk to you again.
Thanks, Russell.
Chris, we get straight into this new permanent war state that we appear to be living in. It felt like during the 60s, when there was the Vietnam conflict and the Korea Wars, that this was a period that had been committed to history, that there was no appetite to see American bodies returning home posthumously. But since then, it seems that, America has been continually engaged in conflict, and it's the repackaging of these conflicts that has changed the marketing of these wars. Why is it that there is a necessity, whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, or a potential forthcoming Taiwan-oriented conflict between the US and China, that there appears to be a necessity for ongoing conflicts? Is it built into the American economic model? Why is it necessary, and why is it so difficult to get balanced reporting around this subject, Chris?
That is a very good question. So one of the things that he pointed out was the Vietnam War. We've been talking a lot about this recently, and I think people have to understand, when I watch documentaries about the Vietnam War, they show the casualties, they talk about the civilian casualties, and apparently during that time, it was actually shown on television. So people were able to see how many civilians were affected by that war, in particular, women, children, people that had nothing to do with this conflict and just trying to live their everyday life. So there was that. And then also there was the draft, and we haven't had a draft since. So because of the draft, there were people who had no intention of ever joining the United States military, had their lives flipped upside down because they were selected to go fight that war. And people who were as young as 18, 17 years old, people were young boys. I'm sorry, but I look at it as you're 17, you're still not really an adult. You're so young, right? So because of the draft, there were more Americans that were directly impacted by the Vietnam War. As time went on, that was no longer the case. Less and less people enlist in the United States military today. That is why the numbers are down. This is why they're trying to recruit kids via Call of Duty video games or via Twitch. I talked about this before, how they try to actively recruit kids on Twitch nowadays because the numbers are down. Deborah says we have the poverty draft. That's a good point. I didn't think of it like that. But there was a period there where after the Vietnam War, we didn't have this type of war. What do you want to call it? Warmongering? We didn't have this type of warmongering in place, but that changed. And that has to do with profits. And so what you have to understand, what Chris is going to dive into here, is the war economy and the reason why we continue to have these conflicts abroad, despite what they may have taught you in school. Because I too used to believe that we were the good guys and we were going over there to stop the bad guys. Notice how the bad guys were never us. was just like every time it was always someone else. It was never us. So that's something to keep in mind. So let me let him go on here.
Yes, it's completely built into the American economic model, as Seymour Melman, the scholar at Columbia, pointed out in books like The Permanent War Economy. So after World War II, you had a perpetuation of the military, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and it justified itself through the Cold War, although it created nuclear arsenals that could wipe out Soviet cities 10 times over. And then, of course, it fed the proxy wars that were very much part of the Cold War. I spent 5 years covering the war in El Salvador, for instance, in the early 1980s. But Vietnam was a very seminal point because you're right. The American middle class did not want their kids coming home in body bags. And so there were two things that happened after Vietnam.
I want to comment on the body bags part just really quick. Also, during the Vietnam War, boys who I'll say this in the most polite way. Rich people and wealthy families were able to find ways to prevent their sons from being drafted. I'm just going to call it what it is, because that's exactly what happened. So a lot of times the people who were being drafted were people who came from poor or working class backgrounds. So for people who were wealthy, they had the resources to make sure that didn't happen to their son, or they had ways of dodging it, like dodging the draft. In fact, Bill Clinton was one of those that dodged the draft. So just keep that in mind, that class, again, when we talk about this particular conflict, class is still a factor.
There was a kind of reckoning that the country asked questions about themselves, or we did as Americans, that we hadn't asked before. There was a kind of, let's call it a period of 10 or 15 years of anti-militarism because of the Vietnam War, which then Ronald Reagan attempted to, I think, successfully restore the quote-unquote good name of war. The other thing is that the military or the militarists realized that they had to abolish the draft, that if they were going to continue the policy of permanent war, they were going to have to fight it with poor kids who didn't have any options and comprised a small, largely powerless demographic within the country in the single digits in terms of.
That's right. So what they did, and this is something that my dad went through, what they did is they actually started sending military recruiters to poor and working class Black and brown neighborhoods. And those were the people that they started to target, the people who didn't have the benefits that the military was offering. The healthcare benefits, TRICARE was phenomenal. I'll be honest. Like, you rarely have to pay for anything. The healthcare benefits, the college benefits, the traveling benefits, kids that had never even left like the Bronx. Now they would get to travel the world. We're going to pay for your housing, so you don't have to pay rent. You don't have to pay for your mortgage. If you do decide to get a house, you can get what's called a VA loan, where you don't have to put anything down. Like, those types of benefits that a lot of those kids would have never been able to have because of the neighborhoods they lived in and the lack of resources that they had in those communities. They targeted those groups, and they really solved that problem. Just like that. Let's go after the poor Black and brown kids. Let's go after them. That's how we'll keep our numbers up, since we got rid of the draft. So there you go.
Percentages. Much of my own family on my mother's side comes from rural Maine, and they are the classic cannon fodder for the military. Unfortunately, I would also add, they're quite susceptible to the propaganda, the flag waving, gun-toting. I'm talking about my own family, but that's another issue. So those two things happened, and that allowed them to continue with war. Now, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, 1989. So I was there with the collapse of the Soviet Union and acutely aware of the promises that have been made to Gorbachev not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. In fact, we were all talking about the peace dividend, which shows you how naive we all were.
That was actually right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So when the Berlin Wall fell, that was supposed to be the end to the expansion, to the NATO expansion.
Believing that there would not be this necessity to commit such large quantities of money, material, research, and human capital into the war industry. Well, the war industry had no intention of going away. That's why it pushed the expansion of NATO, although, of course, as I think you've mentioned on your show, the promises were made not to do. There was a violation of the promises made to Moscow. And I think that expansion of NATO was pushed for two reasons. One, it made the arms industry billions in profits because countries, Poland, et cetera, had to reconfigure their militaries to be compatible with NATO equipment, but also hubris. That's when the United States began to talk about the unipolar world, which is just a fancy way of saying we dominate. Whatever we do, we can do anything we want and nobody can get in our way. Those two things led to the conflict with Ukraine. And just to close, I think that there's a deep understanding now certainly within the U.S. military, that they cannot win a war of attrition against Russia. Russia has bled and bled profusely, no question. But a war of attrition, Ukraine can't win. And I was in the first Gulf War. I was in southern Iraq after the war. I was in the Shiite uprising in Basra, and then I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. But being there, we had no clean water, we had no electricity, the schools were bombed, were destroyed, the hospitals were destroyed. That is a classic tactic that the U.S. military uses. It's what the Russians are using, and that's why you see this panic and sending M1 Abrams tanks. We can talk about that later, which will be largely useless. Talking about uranium-depleted weapons, now you have, through Poland, lobbying to send F-15, F-16 fighter jets. Very, very dangerous. But of course, as we saw with Afghanistan, it doesn't matter whether they can win. The Washington Post published the Afghan papers, which illustrated that the military and political leadership in the United States knew, at best, Afghanistan would be a stalemate. But
20 years in Afghanistan. Now, there was a point that he mentioned that I think is really important and we really need to address. He said, this is how we got to the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I know a lot of times we bring up, well, this had already started like 8 years ago, goes all the way back to 2014. But actually, it goes back even further, because if NATO would not have expanded after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we wouldn't have even gotten to the 2014 point to get us to this point. And so I'm glad that Chris Hedges mentioned that. But again, why did it happen? To make money for the military industrial complex, to make money for the weapon contractors. This is important for people to really understand, because somewhere along the way, the United States government realized that there was money to be made in war, even if that meant that people were going to die. It's not about winning. And so some people don't like when I say this, but I'm going to say it. The fact that the United States government is continuing to give billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine to try to win this war, it is a farce. Ukraine is not going to win this war. You have to understand that. Russia, if they need to, they can also get China to back them. There is a thing called BRICS. They have no chance of winning. By the time this is all said and done, Ukraine's economy will probably be crumbled. The country will be ruined. It'll be in shambles economically. And a lot of more people will be dead. Now, mainstream media isn't going to tell you that. Because then otherwise, if they were to tell you that, how do you justify sending billions of dollars to the country? How do you not justify calling for peace? So they're not going to tell you what I just told you. So what's the point of it? The point of it is to have a never-ending war. It's not about winning the war. It's just to continue to funnel money into the military-industrial complex. That's it. People have to understand that. That's how you get 20 years in Afghanistan. Let's go on.
The war went on for many years. This was also true in Vietnam because war is a business, very lucrative. Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, etc. And we just have been unable to push back against this militarism that is disemboweling the country. If you drive across the United States, our cities and towns and communities are just desolate.
If you're watching us on YouTube now, we are only going to be with you there for another couple of minutes before we click over to being exclusively on Rumble, because I'm going to be asking Chris about the reconstruction of Ukraine, in particular the role of BlackRock and JP Morgan. And
notice he mentioned BlackRock and JP Morgan. So those are other things. So you can see the rest, because they probably didn't want to talk about that piece on YouTube, to be honest. But this video is called "They're Destroying the Country" with Chris Hedges. And this is "Stay Free" with Russell Brand preview. So to see the full interview, you're going to have to go over to Rumble. So I think Russell Brand is another one that has like an exclusive show on Rumble. Like it's him, Kim Iverson, and Glenn Greenwald. So typically it seems like what they'll do is they'll put like part of the interview on YouTube, but the full interview is on Rumble. That's actually pretty smart. That makes people go over to Rumble. So if you want to see the full discussion, you have to hop on over to Rumble to see the rest of that. And I'm pretty sure they probably talked about things that he probably didn't want to put on YouTube because of the censorship. That's probably what this was happening. That's probably why. But yeah, if you're not following them on Rumble, I highly recommend that you do so, because I know for one, like Kim Iverson's show was really good. And Glenn Greenwald's show, System Update on Rumble's really good. Like you guys should check it out. So I'm gonna go to some of the comments here, but you guys get the point. You get the point. And in reference to the budget, did I pull up the defense? I didn't pull it up. I wanted to show you the defense budget. I'm going to show you this really quick, because I want to show you the difference so you could actually see what it was like during the Vietnam War, how much the defense budget was compared to now. And like, you just can't, that's what I'm trying to tell you guys. Like, they can't even make excuses for it anymore. Like, I don't understand how you can even defend it. Like, looking at it now, I'll make this bigger for the people in the back. This is the U.S. military spending defense budget from 1960 to 2023. I'm just going to show you the graph because it's easier that way for you to see what's going on. This is over the years, you guys. Now, I got to shrink it a little bit. I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. So you can see the years. 1960, you have 47.35 billion. Let's look at where we are today. Here. Right here. 867 billion. You see how it just continued over the years? Up, 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 up. There was a drop here. So at some point there were cuts. 1991, there was a little bit of a drop. That's over 300 billion. There were also drops right around here. 1998, there was a decrease. That go up, and it's starting to go up a little bit here in 2001. And then honestly, 04, 03, this is when we're going into Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. 2003 to 2011, I believe, was Iraq. So that makes sense as to why it would increase when we're at war. But what doesn't make any sense is when you get to 2011, we pulled out of Iraq. Then it decreases because we pulled out of Iraq. But then look here. Why did it jump? Go right here. 2018, 682 billion. And then we're going to 2019, 734 billion. So what was happening in 2019? Do you see what the problem is, guys? So even now, it's just like they just increase it. They don't need a reason anymore. Like, we don't have to say we're at war to increase it anymore. That's the problem. Eric, can you put the link to this chart in the chat for people so that they can play around with that at home when they have more free time? You see, guys, like this is a problem. How we go from 1960, 47.35 billion. This is insane. All this money. A hot mess. So like I said, they don't need to have an excuse for it anymore. They just increase it just because. Thank you for the super chat, Snork. Also, journalists filming Vietnam were not murdered. That's a big one, Snork. That's a big one right there. Thank you for mentioning that.